If this is your first time listening to the show, you should know that this is the second episode of our season covering the U.S. Civil War. If you like starting a story from the beginning, I'd recommend listening to episode 1 before continuing on with this one. On the other hand, if you're one of those that doesn't mind jumping right in the middle of a story, well, thanks for joining us. And now, without further ado, on with the show. I am Colby Sumner, and this is America, Fog of War.
Pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, the struggle to preserve our republic. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of...
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender.
Was found a diary under the heading My Pledge. He had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure.
In the last episode, we talked about that man of destiny concept, right? That John Brown seemed to have some sort of supernatural light guiding his path towards the role he was meant to play. Because of the things he had learned throughout his life and the steps he had taken, he ended up being, the right guy at the right place at the right time, kind of a thing. Well, the person we start our story with today could be considered part of that same class. There's really no one else in history that could have done what this man did in the time that he did it. Now, that's my opinion, and remember, I'm no historian, so I'm not sure how weighty my opinion can be taken, but nonetheless, that is the takeaway I get from spending months' worth of time reading and researching for this show. And the man we're getting ready to introduce is one of the most incredible people I've ever read about, so much so that, honestly, I think it'd be a little bit of an injustice to lump him in with John Brown and credit his accomplishments simply to being at the right place at the right time. The more I read and learn about him, the more I find myself thinking on a question. And it's kind of a philosophical question. It's a deep question, but it's something that I can't help but ponder when looking at this individual. And that's, what is the recipe for greatness? Is it something learned or practiced? Can it be taught? Can I boil it down to the step-by-step ingredients to make someone great? Or is it something there's no recipe for? Does greatness originate within the person? Is it something that you're born with and not learned? And the more I attempt to dissolve the stories and myths surrounding this man, the more conflicting I find my answer to that question becoming. Because I find more and more evidence to support both the notion that greatness originates within the man and that greatness is something practiced. There have been many people that have spoken on the topic of greatness, and one that stands out to me is Theodore Roosevelt, and this is what he had to say. Quote, "The boy who is going to make a great man must not make up his mind merely to overcome 1,000 obstacles, but to win in spite of 1,000 repulses and defeats." End quote. I feel like there's a lot of truth to that. And the person I've been referencing today seems to have done just that. I mean, he won't be blessed with any advantages in life. In fact, he will often start with massive disadvantages. He'll face numerous defeats throughout his life, and that's both professionally and personally. But like Teddy Roosevelt said, he approached those defeats as if he had already decided he wouldn't just overcome them, but to win in spite of them. That man, of course, is none other than Abraham Lincoln. And it's through a combination of hard work and that practice, and then that special something that he just seemed to possess from the beginning, that he would make himself into an almost entirely self-made man. The physical embodiment of the American dream in my eyes. I mean, That to me is what the American dream is, right? To go from nothing and to be, achieve greatness along the way and to elevate your position in life and help others. He comes from a beginning of such poverty. I mean, the guy's born in a log cabin with dirt floors. He then ends up successful to the point that he occupies the White House. He's the president of the United States. Not only that, but he achieves the unimaginable at at points in his life by sheer willpower alone. He'll keep this country that we have so fortunately inherited today from sliding into oblivion. And in the process, he'll make the words penned by the founding fathers true for all peoples living from sea to shining sea. And it's early on that he begins to display the qualities and habits that shape him into the great man he becomes. It's also early on that Lincoln's going to encounter his first obstacles that he has to not only overcome, but win in spite of. Lincoln is born drastically poor, like I had mentioned before. He'll even say, when asked about this, when asked about his childhood, that there was no point in looking into it because it could be condensed into a single sentence: the short and simple annals of the poor. He and his family were too poor even to buy paper, and this is one of those things in his early life for me that stands out as an example of an obstacle that he just defies. He also knows from having watched how his father worked and having to do that same work himself. I mean, his father would hire him out to neighbors, to strangers, to do a day's worth, a week's worth, a month's worth of work. And Lincoln knew he didn't want to live that kind of existence. He wanted to elevate himself. He wanted to use his mind and not his body. So he knew he needed to learn how to read and write. Now, for me, if I was in that situation and I couldn't afford paper, I don't really know what I would do. I can tell you, I don't think I would have done what he did. He would teach himself to write by scratching letters into a plank of wood with a pocket knife. When the plank of wood was full of writing, he would simply whittle down the surface of the plank once again just so he could have clear space to write on, and do this over and over and over again. That's a different level of motivated right there. That's motivation for great things. And he will continue this throughout his life. He will famously, a little later on, decide he wants to become a lawyer. Well, the first step in that process is you got to pass the bar. Lincoln didn't have the money to go to law school. So the route that he has to take is going to be one without the benefit of a classroom, a teacher, or any kind of mentor. He's going to actually teach himself the law well enough to pass the bar, and he's going to do that by borrowing books. So you have to assume that he did, first off, probably wasn't even able to collect all the books necessary to fully understand and have a realistic shot at passing the bar. But with the books that he does collect, he will read and reread them again many, many, many times over until he understands the subject matter and ideas those books contain completely. I mean, the guy's incredible. He'll go on to pass the bar and start a successful law practice. He'll also get into politics. He'll get elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834. He'll also get elected to one of the state's congressional seats in 1847. Now, throughout this time, it's not all rose gardens. It's many, many defeats and obstacles he is having to face time and time again. I mean, throughout his political career, he's going to be defeated in many campaigns. He'll be elected to his term in Congress, the congressional seat for Illinois, and then voted out of office the very next term by the same people that voted him in the first time. He will also, during this period, lose one of his children to sickness. And I have no way to even compare or relate to that. I can't imagine that. But he still decides to succeed, to win, in spite of all of these overwhelming obstacles that continue to present themselves to him time and time again. And we're going to pick up our story with Lincoln in May of 1860. He had taken a few years off from the political arena and now finds himself once more square in the middle of it. This time, however, he's not seeking a congressional seat or a seat in the Senate. He'll be seeking nomination as the presidential candidate at the Republican National Convention. Now, there's been a few things up to this point that shows Lincoln's effort, his grit when trying to become what he envisions himself being. But it's here at the Republican National Convention that us looking back on this in the historical sense really get the first glimpse of the true political genius Lincoln had developed throughout his life. I have to imagine that all these obstacles and all the disadvantages that he has had to work with and overcome have made him quite flexible and creative in coming up with solutions to those problems. Well, Lincoln had a problem at the Republican National Convention. He had very long odds of actually succeeding and getting nominated. He was little known outside of Illinois, and the candidates he opposed were all well-known and highly experienced politicians. But like I said, that creativeness and flexibility and problem-solving pays great dividends for Lincoln in this contest. Because he did have a plan, and it would turn all of those negative attributes into beneficial ones. The Republican Party was sure to carry all but a few of the northern states in the 1860 presidential election. Now, they had written off any possibility of winning any of the southern states. At this point, there was no chance of that. But as far as the northern states go, in order to win the majority of electorates that any candidate would need to be able to secure the presidency, the party would need to carry Pennsylvania and either Illinois or Indiana. Now, Lincoln, obviously, being from Illinois, is well known there, but like I had mentioned earlier, he's little known outside of that region. But Lincoln also knew that, just like him, his opponents also had major obstacles to overcome if they hoped to carry those states. Their obstacles come from long careers in politics. You know, things like being radical on hot-button issues of the day, the abolitionist topic in more specific terms. Some people might have alienated immigrant communities in previous elections that they had participated in. Pennsylvania, for instance, has a very large German population in this era. For some, they had just made too many enemies in government. Again, all those could be results of having too long a career in the political arena. But nonetheless, they all had obstacles and had taken hard stances on very pivotal issues in this election season. Lincoln, on the other hand, the one thing about being obscure is he's considered the middle-of-the-road candidate. He's the rail-splitting representative of the yeoman farmer, a guy that's you could see chewing on a length of straw, wearing one-strapped overalls, he's the hillbilly. He's the frontier guy. He's not dangerous. At least that's how most of the factions that made up the Republican Party at this time viewed him. Now, there were three candidates in particular that Lincoln really had to compete against to secure the nomination. The most important of those is going to be the leading candidate. His name is William H. Seward. Now, Seward was supported by most of the delegates from the upper north. But because of his radical stance on abolition, Republican leaders from the lower north worried he couldn't carry their states in an election. You got to remember, in this era, those lower northern states are directly north of the South, right? Those borders are not concrete. Ideas can move their ways north of that border and south of that border. And a lot of the viewpoints in these upper South and lower northern states are not going to be so cut and dry as what you see, the further north or south you go. So for someone that has a hard stance on abolition, in this era, they're really making winning those lower northern states very difficult. There was also the fear that if Seward got nominated and then eventually elected to the presidency, his election would result in conflict, like a massive conflict over slavery. Little did these people know what lay ahead, but at the time, that was the feeling, right? He was so ardent an abolitionist, they felt that it was very unlikely to avoid conflict if he were the candidate. So Lincoln's plan is to go after second-choice commitments from the delegations that are supporting these three other candidates, most importantly out of them, Seward. And what I mean by second-choice commitments is every delegation that's there at the Republican National Convention has a favorite candidate. If that favored candidate, after the first ballot tallies come in, seem as though they're too far from securing enough ballots to win the nomination, then those delegations might start looking to other candidates that have a better shot at winning. Most importantly, to defeat the candidates that they don't like, right? So, Bates's delegates might not like what Seward is espousing or what Chase has to say about a certain topic, and vice versa. So Lincoln steps in as this middle-of-the-road character with, honestly, the only true likelihood of carrying the entire North, and that's what he has his campaign lieutenants tell all these state delegations throughout the night of May 17th. Hey, man, listen, if your guy doesn't get enough votes in this first ballot casting, why don't you look over here and consider us as the second choice? We don't need first place. We'll take second place. Well, after 3 very close ballots, the convention had nominated its candidate, and Lincoln's plan worked. He won the nomination and would be the Republican candidate for the presidency going into the 1860 presidential campaign. The first task he needed to accomplish was to unify the Republican Party. This is a party that's made up of a bunch of factions from older, no longer existing political parties. You got the Whig Party in there. You've got some Northern Democrats that have come over to this side of the aisle as well. You've got everything you can think of inside of the Republican Party at this time. And they want to capitalize on some of the momentum that seems to be coming their way on a national scale. To do this, Lincoln would do something no other presidential candidate had done before him. He's going to enlist the services of the men he just defeated, Seward and the other 2 guys, their names being Salmon P. Chase and Edward Bates. And he does do it. He gets them onto his campaign team. And Lincoln will actually send the 3 of them, Seward, Chase, and Bates, out on the campaign trail for him, because in this era, the 19th century, it was tradition for whoever the presidential candidate was to not go out on a speaking tour. So he has Seward, Chase, and Bates do it for him. Lincoln's plan is to stay put in his headquarters right there in Springfield. And he's going to orchestrate and mastermind this campaign with the precision that only a master politician could. Now, as Lincoln and his campaign staff got to work, the rest of the country watched on nervously, because the most crucial election in American history was getting ready to start, and I do believe the people at the time even knew that. Now, in the last episode, we talked about the things that led up to and inspired John Brown and his raid. Well, in the aftermath of that raid and his subsequent execution, America will feel the effects of 2 almost immediate reactions on a national level. The first is an emotional reaction. People in the North are going to have a very deep sense of grief over Brown and his execution for his actions at Harper's Ferry. Again, they viewed him as a martyr dying for the cause of freedom. Well, Southerners down south are witnessing this display of sympathy for Brown, and they feel as though, in very clear language, they're being told there's no longer a place for their culture in the Union. And support for secession is going to grow. People are going to start talking about it a lot more frequently. And people that were tiptoeing the line are going to begin to deviate towards the side of disunion. Now, the second of those reactions is going to be a political reaction. Southern Democrats wanted their next candidate to run on a platform that would support them not losing this institution of slavery. Again, beyond all the racist motivation involved in slavery, I mean, this is what their economy is based on in the South. So they want their next, candidate, the next candidate of the Democratic Party, to run on a platform that guarantees slavery in all the territories. Now, that's a problem for the Democratic frontrunner of the time. We've talked about this guy quite a few times already. Stephen Douglas. This is the guy from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and he's the guy that got the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. He's been in the story a good bit. We talked about him a lot in the first episode. He can't support that platform. And he can't support that because none of the Northern Democratic voters could support that. The farthest that any of them would go in that direction would be supporting popular sovereignty. And again, just to touch on that, that's essentially the local populace voting on what they prefer their state to be, whether it be a free state or a slave state, or a free territory or a slave territory. But that's as far as they could go. Now, that refusal is going to create a split, a fracture in the Democratic Party. And they would go into the 1860 election divided and facing off against a very united Republican Party. Now, all in all, there are 4 different parties campaigning for the 1860 presidential election. Their influence can be consolidated into 2 camps, though. You got the Republican Party and then everybody else. And really, out of that everybody else group, the most significant one is going to be Stephen Douglas and the Democratic Party. There's 2 other parties as well. There's the Constitutional Union Party and the Southern Rights Party. But Douglas and the Democratic Party are the only ones out of the 3 of them that really put up any kind of opposition for Lincoln at all, or any kind of competition in the election of 1860. Now, the hope of those 3 parties, the parties that are in that everyone else camp, was at least they could, in theory, get enough electorates from a combination of upper southern states and lower northern states that Lincoln wouldn't be able to get the electorates needed to win the election, sending the election into the House for them to make the decision. And the reason they thought they could do that is each one of those parties individually were no match for the Republican Party in 1860. But they were thinking, hey, man, no, you got Kansas and you've got Maryland and you've got Missouri, you've got Kentucky. If we all work together, we might be able to pull this off. That theory didn't play out, and that hope never materialized into anything. And instead, it became more and more evident that Lincoln was going to carry nearly all of the free states in the North, which meant he was most likely going to be elected as president. And it's that likelihood and this memory of John Brown as a martyr in the North that really is going to stir things up down South. There's going to be somewhat of a hysteria that kind of takes hold down there. And it all kind of centers around this fear that, the election of a Republican president is going to lead to dozens and dozens of John Brown copycats invading the South. And the citizens down there were afraid that if this did happen, there was going to be slave insurrections. And if you're curious as to how that could play out for the populace, just look at the Haitian Revolution. Brutal. And I'm not saying it wouldn't have been justified. But you do have to admit, if we're looking at this through some sort of, balanced perspective on history, the fear could be understandable. Now, this fear that everyone had in the South at this time is going to cause many nasty cases of mob justice. And it's situations like these that I try to put myself in the position of the people affected by all these kind of things throughout history. And it's easier for me to do that now with combat. I have been to combat, so I can relate in a lot of certain instances. Even with guys from the Civil War, I can hear a firsthand account from the Civil War and think, I know exactly what he's talking about. But this is one of those things that I don't really have any knowledge on, and I have a pretty imaginative mind, but sometimes it's just hard to fathom. Case in point, I read an account of a person being tarred and feathered, and there's a certain comical quality to at least what I would typically picture when I think of tarring and feathering. And I think that has a lot to do with the cartoons we grew up on and how that's kind of been portrayed in pop culture nowadays. But the reality was that people were being stripped naked in public by mobs of angry people, beaten, spit on, cussed at, threatened their lives. And then they have hot, almost boiling tar thrown on their naked bodies, and not once, but a few times, to make sure most of the surface area gets covered. I would imagine that you're going to get a few degrees of burns when that happens. And you could smell the tar when they're getting ready to do it. I could just, it would be terrible. It would be terrible. And to make the entire situation just that much more humiliating for the person going through it, they'd cover you in bird feathers. I mean, that had to be impossible to get off. And then they leave you naked on the ground in the middle of the town. Everybody in the town's laughing at you. No one's offering a helping hand whatsoever. And oftentimes this happens to completely innocent people. If at this time you're down south, especially depending on how deep in the South you go, if you didn't have a Southern accent, good luck. Now, tarring and feathering isn't the only thing that's going to happen. These retaliatory mobs are going to seek many forms of justice, or at least in air quotes, justice to them. There are going to be several lynchings of suspected insurrectionists, and that's both black and white. Threats of disunion are going to boom during this time, and secession sentiment will also. To give you a glimpse of the mood in the South at that time, I'm going to give you a quote from an Atlanta newspaper. And as bad as the rhetoric can be between, news anchors and political players, or news anchors from CNN and news anchors from Fox, and in today's world, it's nothing like this. Quote, "Let the consequences be what they may, whether the Potomac is crimson in human gore and Pennsylvania Avenue is paved 10 fathoms deep with mangled bodies, the South will never submit to such humiliation and degradation as the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln." End quote. Whether the Potomac is crimsoned in human gore and Pennsylvania Avenue is paved 10 fathoms deep with mangled bodies. I mean, that's serious. But there's nothing that could be done for the people of the South at this point, because the fact of the matter was, Lincoln was about to win the election. And on November 6, 1860, the vote tallies confirmed it. Abraham Lincoln was going to be the next president of the United States. Now, in the North at this time, immediately following his election, there's mass celebration out on the streets. An ardent abolitionist, Wendell Phillips, is going to say to a celebrating crowd in Boston, quote, "For the first time in our history, the slave has chosen a president of the United States." End quote. It's pretty incredible. That had to feel pretty triumphant. And I think for most of the people in the upper North, they got that. But it's important to remember also that Lincoln won the election with the votes of fewer than 4 in 10 Americans. He wasn't even listed on the ballot in 9 southern states. And while his victory was absolutely incredible, this fact didn't go unnoticed in the South. And the fear that had captivated the South throughout 1860 would turn to outrage in 1861.
Do you own a business or operate with an organization that needs to purchase supplies regularly? If so, Colby and I recommend trying Amazon Business. We use Amazon Business and couldn't be happier with our experience. With our membership, we are able to keep our costs down and choose from millions of products related to our industry. Whether you shop with Amazon or not, you will discover Amazon Business to be a user-friendly process. Business Prime is a separate membership from Amazon Prime, but with the same free shipping and more benefits when making purchases. Make workplace procurement easier with convenient delivery options, simplified purchasing workflows, multiple payment options, and a competitive marketplace with business-only pricing and quantity discounts. With Amazon Business, organizations of any size can simplify buying, so check it out. Creating an account is simple, easy, and of course, it's free. Visit americafogofwar.com and follow the link, Try Amazon Business, located in the menu at the top of the homepage to gain access to all these great benefits and more.
The country at this point in time makes me think of a out-of-control car that's speeding towards the edge of a sheer cliff. And there is brake failure and mechanical failure. There's nothing you can do to stop this car. It is just on its way. And the space between the car and the edge of the cliff is decreasing exponentially. And the man that could be considered getting that car to the situation it finds itself in, or at least partially responsible for getting the car into this position, is a man named Stephen Douglas. And we've talked about him quite a bit throughout the last episode and this one as well. He's made famous for his proposal for the Kansas-Nebraska Act and getting that and a few other very substantial bills passed in the halls of government. He's also one of Lincoln's opponents, like I said earlier, in the 1860 presidential election. Now, he, unlike Lincoln, has decided to campaign personally. He's breaking with tradition. Lincoln, like the tradition had been up to this point in the mid-19th century, decided not to go out on a speaking tour. It was thought of as being a little bit beneath whoever was hoping to attain the presidency of the United States. But for Stephen Douglas, he didn't see it that way. He knew he faced a lot, and he had ambitions of actually winning. And as he's conducting this campaign, he's traveling from town to town and state to state, and he's seeing what's going on in the country. And he's watching it all unravel around him. And I have to imagine that he has to feel somewhat responsible, at least in a small way, for what he's seeing. And I kind of feel bad for the guy. You know, I know that the Kansas-Nebraska Act and many of the other things that he had either done with his political career or supported in his political career are not on the list of moral high points when it comes to our history. But that being said, if we're looking at this through, a somewhat neutral historical lens, right, we're just studying the story. And one of my favorite things to do is to try to put myself in the position of people in these crazy situations. And I can't help but feel bad for the guy, because you can see, as I'm getting ready to show you, he did not want the dissolution of the country. He did not want states to secede. He didn't want war. But it's because of him, at least a good chunk of the reason is because of him, that the country's in this place. And regardless of whether or not he feels guilt over what he's seeing, we do know that he finds it supremely troubling. Because while he's campaigning in Iowa, this is somewhere about midway through the campaign, he's going to realize that Lincoln is in fact going to win the election. And from that point on, he is going to spend the remainder of the time he has left in his presidential campaign in the Deep South, trying to save the Union. He's going to try to stop this out-of-control car from actually flying over the edge of the cliff to its doom. Now, at this time, he's very ill. He's actually going to die a little less than a year later after this. I had read that he led a pretty indulgent lifestyle. On top of that, he was a workaholic, almost of the same intensity as Alexander Hamilton. And that's about as extreme as it gets. Well, those two aspects of his life had really taken a toll on him. And he didn't have much time left. But with the time that he did have left, he would do what he could to stop this car from going over the edge. He would do what he can to keep the country together. Now, the entire time he is in the Deep South, he's going to be under constant threat of violence, but he'll still do his duty anyways. He will go from town to town throughout the Deep South, speaking out against disunion and secession. He'll be resting in Mobile, Alabama on the day Lincoln is elected, and he will witness firsthand the reaction of the public to Lincoln's victory. I would imagine public outrage and fury doesn't quite sum up what he was seeing as he walked the streets of Mobile, Alabama. I feel like he had to lose all hope there. Because he knew right then whatever efforts he was contributing to stopping this disunion, stopping secession, and stopping war had all been in vain. Douglas could see, unlike most Northerners at the time, that the South's threats during the campaign weren't just political scare tactics. Many of the Northern politicians from this point in our story are under the impression that, all these threats of disunion and secession and we'll fight to get what we want kind of stuff, that all those things are scare tactics. And the reason they think that is because they have used them before in previous political battles and campaign years and election years. The ones of the past, however, were just political judo in the efforts of trying to get what they desired done. Douglas could see that this was not that, though. Douglas could see that the people of the South meant what they were saying. This wasn't just your normal political judo. And he felt as though he was watching the great experiment collapsing right before his eyes. Now, Lincoln is elected November 6th, 1860, and he's sworn in on March 4th of 1861. But between those two dates, that's roughly 4 months' time, there is a lot that happens. Almost immediately, Lincoln's election will have secessionist journalists and politicians speaking to their readers and constituents on scenarios that they might find themselves in playing the part of the victim under the new Republican administration. Now, this is important to keep in mind because there's been a huge change in the power dynamic for the people running the country. According to James McPherson, from 1789 to 1861, Southern politicians will make up 23 of the 36 speakers of the House, 24 of the 36 presidents pro tem of the Senate, 20 of the 35 Supreme Court justices. That, by the way, gave them the majority control the entire time from 1789 to 1861. And for 70% of that same window of time, even the President of the United States will be a Southern politician. The South had been used to dictating governmental policy, and almost overnight they are watching it dissolve right out of their fingertips. And this change in the power dynamic had many in the South, fearing what could come of it. For instance, things like the exclusion of slavery from the territories, eventually leading to the admittance of so many new free states that the South would be beyond outnumbered in Congress. Minus the slavery topic, that's something that we would worry about today, right? We're concerned with the voter demographics of different key states, and especially the ones with numerous senators and congressmen and many more electorates than some of the smaller ones, the swing states. The political parties on both sides of the aisle are concerned with that today. Another one is that Lincoln would appoint Republican justices to the Supreme Court, seize that majority power that the South had enjoyed for so long, as well as make decisions and set future precedents that favor the Republican and Northern way of life. A big one for the slave-owning population in the South would be that Congress would repeal the Fugitive Slave Act we talked about so much in the last episode. This would, in their minds, instigate thousands of slaves to flee northward. Now, not to justify the institution of slavery by any means, because it is our greatest sin. It's a horrible travesty. But for the South at this time, there's numerous factors as to why that is a scary situation for them. One of the main ones being that their entire economy is based around slave labor. If slavery just disappears overnight, so does their economy. And for the people of the Deep South, this turn of events was too much to accept. And in December of 1860, South Carolina is going to hold a convention to decide its future relationship with the government of the United States. And at this convention, the delegates will vote unanimously to secede from the Union. And this, just like tipping over the first domino in a line, will cause others to follow suit. In January of 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana will also hold conventions that vote to secede. Texas will do likewise on February 1st, making it the 7th state to secede in less than 2 months. 7 states, man. Lincoln's still almost 2 months from taking office at this time. If you were him, what would be going through your mind when you get the news that there's now 7 states that have seceded from the Union? I know for me it would be beyond troublesome. I don't know if I could do the job. I'm positive I couldn't do it. I don't have the faculties to handle that kind of weight and responsibility. But for the people of the Deep South, the feeling was kind of energetic. They felt as though they were the second coming of the Revolutionary Patriots from 1776. There was an exception, though. They believed their means by claiming independence was constitutionally legal. That's because Southerners believed in something called the compact theory of the Constitution. That Southern states viewed their relationship with the federal government as an elective one that originated as a result of the decision from a state convention. Those states believed that they had only given the federal government authority to exercise certain functions of their sovereignty, but not take complete control of it. And it's because of this, in air quotes, understanding, it would be legal to end that relationship by the decision of another convention. The legality of secession will play a large role in the approach Lincoln takes when he assumes office. as well as in the Confederate government's strategy throughout the war. Just like George Washington and the Patriots, they would try to make the human cost of the war too much for the North to accept, take their will to fight from them. But more importantly, just as the Founding Fathers did with France towards the close of the Revolution, the South hoped to gain the recognition of another European power as a sovereign nation, as well as an alliance with them, Britain. With that, they figured they could force the North to seek peace. But that's a little later in our story. For now, those 7 states from the Deep South do know one thing that needs to be done. They need some muscle. And they begin strengthening and bulking up their existing militia units, as well as encourage the formation of new military units. And the response to this call is overwhelming. Thousands of men are going to volunteer themselves for service in their state militia regiments, these new ones that are popping up all over the place. And those militia regiments begin quickly seizing federal facilities. Things like federal forts to maintain their borders or to protect their harbors or inlets or vital railways and waterways, and armories as well. That's a little more obvious. They want to be able to arm these new units that they're forming up, and they're going to get the weapons and munitions to do that with from these existing federal armories. Now, the sitting president at this time, just remember, again, we're not even under Lincoln yet. This is still the Buchanan administration. And President Buchanan believes this entire crisis is solely the responsibility of Lincoln. But he has a problem. He still has 4 months left in office before Lincoln's inauguration. So what does he do? I mean, that is a crazy situation to find yourself in as well. He will make his sole priority for the remainder of the time that he does have left keeping the government functioning and the country out of a war. Making all of this much more complicated than it already is, the majority of Buchanan's advisors are Southerners, and they're just buying time in the Northern government until their respective states secede, till they can go down south and put on a gray uniform, essentially. One of them, Buchanan's Secretary of War, that would be the modern-day Secretary of Defense, is under suspicion of treason. Apparently, he had transferred weapons and munitions from federal installations in the North to installations in the South, all for the purpose of trying to help arm and equip these new regiments that keep forming up. I mean, I know Buchanan gets a bad rap historically, and that's all right. I'm okay with that. He deserves a little bit of a bad rap. But this situation is crazy. He's essentially got enemy double agents advising him. He's got 7 states that have seceded from the Union. He's got 4 months left in office, so he can't really do anything that substantial anyways and then follow through on it. He just seems like he's the guy trying to plug the hole in the dam. Well, regardless of how Buchanan is feeling or what's happening in the Buchanan administration, the 7 states that have seceded from the Union in the Deep South hold a constitutional convention, and in 4 days they complete a provisional constitution. Now, the permanent constitution will be completed and adopted about a month after this, but 4 days' time to complete their provisional constitution. That's fast. That's lightning fast. And when you compare that to the founding fathers of the Revolution, that's a blink of an eye. Now, they're able to do this because the Confederate Constitution is essentially a copy of the U.S. Constitution, with the exception of a few added provisions. There's the states' rights provision, and it says essentially, each state is to act in its sovereign and independent character. And then there's the cornerstone of this entire situation, an explicit guarantee for slavery in all the states and territories within the Confederation. When you read about this and you see things like what was being said in newspapers, what some of these politicians were saying, it is crystal clear that this war, at least at the higher political levels, was started over the institution of slavery. And delegates at that same convention will also elect the Confederacy's provisional president. And the man they choose brings a long resume of qualifications and experience with him. He's a West Point graduate, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a former U.S. congressman, and a 2-time U.S. senator. He also will serve as the Secretary of War for President Pierce. The man they elect, of course, is Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis and his new Confederate government, as well as the U.S. government during this time, have a huge problem they have to deal with. The problem was a question. What are the 8 states of the Upper South going to do? Because I had mentioned before, we've got 7 states that have seceded, but that's not the entire South, and that definitely doesn't make up the entire Confederacy. So the remainder of those states, places like Virginia, places like Missouri and Kansas, Kentucky, what are they going to do? For the U.S. government, they've already lost 7 states, and they are desperately trying to keep the remainder securely in the Union. They can't afford to lose anymore. Because for every one of the upper southern states that choose to secede and join the Confederacy, the North faces a greater challenge in bringing those states back into the fold, which means an even greater likelihood that this great experiment would end in failure, its demise the result of self-inflicted wounds. Now, for the Confederate government, if the Upper South decides to stay in the Union, securing their independence will practically become an impossibility. McPherson makes the point in his book, Ordeal by Fire. Without the Upper South, the Confederacy would have just 5% of the industrial capacity of the North. They'll have less than 1/5 the population of the North. And if we're going to be really accurate about fighting men, especially for the Confederacy, if we only count the white population, that ratio falls down to 1/10. Towards the middle of the war, the Union will start using USCT, U.S. colored troops, in combat. This will be around the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. The South, with the exception of very, very few rare cases, won't do that. So their white population is crucial because that's where the bulk of their fighting men are going to come from. Without these upper southern states, they've got 1/10 the population the North does. That's an extreme disadvantage when it comes to numbers. The Upper South's decision could very well predict the outcome of a war, and more importantly, the fate of the United States. And the entire country watched on as all of this unfolded with feelings of excitement and horror as Lincoln prepared to step into his new role as President of the United States. Do you love America Fog of War and want more of it? If so, Brett and I would love it if you became a member of the America Fog of War Patreon. Visit americafogofwar.com and follow the link Become a Member located in the menu at the top of the homepage and pick from one of our 3 membership subscription options. As a member, you can enjoy ad-free early access to all of our free episodes, like this one, as well as gain access to not 1, but 2 extra episodes a month, and join either Brett or myself on a monthly Zoom call where you can help us make decisions pertaining to future episodes of America Fog of War, discuss war movies and books, and talk about some of your favorite American battles and campaigns, hip pocket class style. Your membership subscriptions are what enable us to bring you the content you love every month. Help us grow this podcast and become part of the team today at americafogofwar.com. By this time, Lincoln has made his way to D.C. and is preparing himself for his inauguration. I hope I've done a sufficient enough job to convince you just how out of control all of this is and the extreme chaos of the situation Lincoln's getting ready to inherit. He has to do something now to maintain the appearance of national authority in the South, while at the same time, he doesn't want to instigate them into a war. So he's got to be careful. He's got to walk a very narrow line. He'll do this by performing a balancing act, essentially, and he does it with his inaugural address, the first one. It is probably the most important inaugural address we've ever had as a country. And the last little bit of this speech really kind of sums up Lincoln's message, almost to a T. He'll say, quote, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies, though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." End quote. I love the way Lincoln writes. His speeches are incredible to me. But Lincoln takes this position out of hope, the position to deny the right of secession without resorting to violence. He wants there to be a way for the administration to maintain its support among both Northerners and Southern Unionists. And the hope is that eventually that will lead the Deep South into what they termed at the time voluntary reconstruction, voluntarily entering back into the Union. And again, like we had mentioned before, if the Upper South decides to stay in the Union, I mean, the Confederacy has no chance at maintaining its own sovereignty. The only thing Lincoln needed at this point was time. Time was the most valuable commodity he had on his side if he wanted this plan to work. He had to stall. He had to keep things as they were. They could not progress any worse than what they were at this moment. In the last episode, I mentioned how if fate wants something done, fate's going to get something done. Well, we had talked earlier about Southern militia seizing federal property pretty much right after Lincoln's election, and then continuing on through this point we're at now. Well, by this time, there only remains a handful of forts that are still under federal control in the Deep South. One of those forts is located in the epicenter of secession, the place where it all started, South Carolina, in Charleston Harbor. It's been under siege for months now, and it's being held that way by thousands of Confederate militia. When Lincoln enters the Oval Office on his first day, he finds a dispatch waiting for him on his desk. As he reads it, the time he had been hoping to gain from the position he took in his inaugural address evaporated completely. The dispatch is from the commander of the U.S. garrison in Charleston. In it, he tells Lincoln, "Hey man, look, if me and my guys aren't resupplied, we're going to run out of provisions in 4 to 6 weeks, and Fort Sumter is going to be surrendered to the Confederate militia." The garrison in Charleston is a small one. It's around 80 guys. And they're under the command of a major named Robert Anderson, major in the U.S. Army. And like I said, by this time they occupy Fort Sumter, a fort with brick walls 40 feet tall and 12 feet thick in some places. It's built on a man-made island in the center of Charleston Harbor. Well, Major Anderson and his men had initially been ordered to occupy a different fort in the Charleston Harbor area. It's a much older fort, and it had been neglected for quite a while up to this point, and had become indefensible because of that. When South Carolina secedes, Anderson decides to move his force of 80 men to the more secure protection of Fort Sumter's walls. This is cool. You don't get to see the intricate details of this kind of stuff with something so long ago. But they're going to do it at night. They're going to do a nighttime op in the mid-19th century. That blows my mind. No night vision, no radios. They're going to have to go through enemy territory to find a few rowboats that they have concealed near the water's edge, then row out to Fort Sumter while carrying cannon and all kind of other supplies with them. And at the same time, they're going to have to dodge Confederate patrol boats that are sweeping the waters of Charleston Harbor between the fort they were in before this and Fort Sumter. This move has effects on multiple areas of the crisis. And Anderson obviously didn't have any desire to affect any other circumstance of this crisis situation. He just wanted to get his guys into a more defensible position. Sumter enrages Southern citizens. They're going to view it as a breach of good faith with the status quo they've been implementing up to this point. But it also bolsters hope and faith in the Union for the North. So things again are kind of ratcheting down, and it becomes obvious that from this point on, surrendering Fort Sumter without hostilities really can't be an option. There's too many people in the North that have the opinion of keeping and maintaining that location at all costs. If the presidential administration surrenders it, just here you go, no fight, just take it, it's yours. Beyond all the things it means for the country, it's political suicide for whoever's in charge of that administration. And still, while under the Buchanan administration, that the problem of supplies and reinforcements really start to rear their head. Buchanan decides to dispatch a civilian ship to resupply Fort Sumter instead of a military transport. Again, just keep in mind his main priority is to keep the government running and stay out of a war. So, in an effort to do that and still get his guys resupplied, he's going to attempt to use a civilian transport ship. No guns. I'm not coming in here armed. This should be easy. But while the ship's en route to Charleston Harbor, news of the operation is leaked to the press. And the rebel militia in the defenses ringing Charleston Harbor know the ship is on its way, and they're actively getting ready for it. On the morning of January 9th, that ship, known as the Star of the West, steered into the channel near the fort. And there will be 2 cannon shots fired at this ship. They'll be fired from a South Carolina battery covering the harbor. Get this is kind of interesting. The guns are manned by students from the Citadel. And for those of you that don't know what the Citadel is, considered still to this day to be one of the better military preparatory universities in the country. It's right there in Charleston. And they were excited, as all young guys are when they get their chance to see the elephant, as they would say in this time, but get their chance to fight, get their chance to prove themselves. I felt that way my first time going to combat. I felt that way my second time going to combat. Everybody does. Now, more shots are going to be fired at the Star of the West, and eventually she'll suffer a hit. She'll reverse course and return out to the safety of open sea. Now, the entire operation, this Star of the West operation, is considered a failure, both privately and publicly, from top to bottom. In fact, I actually read the only reason that those artillery volleys fired from the cannons manned by those Citadel students, the only reason they're not considered the first shots of the war is because Major Anderson and the garrison on Fort Sumter didn't return fire on the rebel militia. Well, they didn't return fire because they didn't know who the rebel militia were firing at. They had no clue that the ship they watched enter and then leave Charleston Harbor that day was carrying supplies for them, or that it was sent there on behalf of the U.S. government. Word of the resupply hadn't reached them. If it had, it wasn't specific as to when the resupply was coming or any of the details that would be involved with the operation. Now, Lincoln, inheriting the Fort Sumter crisis from the Buchanan administration, finds himself facing other problems on top of this. He also has to deal with the major divisions within his administration. The commanding general of the U.S. Army at the time, a man by the name of General Winfield Scott, tells Lincoln that simply reinforcing the fort isn't possible. He advises Lincoln that it would take a large fleet and 25,000 troops to successfully reinforce and resupply the fort. The thing is, at this time in our history, the entire U.S. Army, even the guys out manning forts and installations out in the West, doesn't number 25,000 men. He's basically telling Lincoln, hey, this is impossible. Now, William H. Seward, you'll remember, that's Lincoln's biggest opponent from the Republican National Convention, is now his Secretary of State. Now, he thinks he can do a better job than Lincoln. He believes it so much he's going to establish secret back-channel communications with Confederate commissioners to whom he'll pass word to that Fort Sumter would be surrendered to South Carolinian officials. And he does this on his own authority, not that of Lincoln's. Seward then linked information about the back-channel communications that he's been having with these, Southern commissioners to the press. He's trying to force Lincoln's hand, make him feel public pressure so he'll give up the fort. Obviously, Seward didn't understand who he was dealing with yet. Lincoln had to remind him who was in charge and that it was Lincoln's decision to make regarding whether or not they were going to keep or surrender the fort. Lincoln had decided it wasn't time for surrender. In mid-March, he'll ask each cabinet member to provide a written answer to the question, if it's possible, should we resupply Fort Sumter? Only one member of his cabinet will give unconditional approval to the question. The rest vote to avoid any confrontation with the South whatsoever. Many are in the same line that Seward is. Just give it up. So again, what do you do if you're Lincoln? I was talking about his greatness at the beginning of this episode. And it's situations like this that I find it so irresistible to acknowledge the fact that he was incredibly great. Just to recap what all is going on and what he has to take care of and fix. There's 7 states claiming secession and have just formed a constitutional government that he has to get back into the Union. He has the national news story of a U.S. military garrison under siege and running out of food in Charleston that he has to do something about too. The commanding general of his military doesn't have any realistic plans for fixing the situation and is most likely unenthusiastic due to political motivations. His Secretary of State not only believes he can do the job better, but is actively pursuing policies and negotiations behind his back. In his inaugural address, Lincoln pledges to hold the property of the U.S. government. But so far, there's only one member of his cabinet that supports that notion. If this would have been any other person that would have been considered qualified at that time, it's almost certain that this would have been the end of the United States as we know it. Lincoln knows that he needs to do something, and he needs to do it now. But the question of the Upper South still is hanging over everybody's head. How could he position himself and the Union on the moral high ground in this situation? He can't be seen as the one that starts the war. Well, he gets an idea, and his idea is a lot like what Buchanan decided to do. He was going to send resupplies to Fort Sumter, but he was going to do that on an unarmed ship. Now, there's a few differences in the plan. Lincoln is going to also send troops and a U.S. naval escort for that ship, a very, very armed escort. But they're going to stay out of the harbor. They're going to stay out at sea. Initially, it would just be this one unarmed ship taking food in to the U.S. garrison that's been isolated there on Fort Sumter for so long. He's also going to notify Southern leaders of his intended resupply and the conditions under which the resupply would be made. Now, all of this, ideally, is positioning him on the moral high ground. Either way it's played out. By leaving the troops out at sea, he's simply trying to feed starving men. By notifying the Confederate leadership of his intentions, any hostile action taken on the ship hauling the food for the garrison will make the Confederates look like the aggressors. Lincoln's essentially given himself a win-win, at least as far as the question over the Upper South goes. If he resupplies his men and the Confederate troops don't fire on the ship, well, then his men are resupplied, the fort can stay in federal hands, and war is averted. If the Confederate forces do fire on the ship, Lincoln didn't take the first shot, and he made every effort to do this resupply mission in a non-hostile way. Lincoln's going to give the order to execute this expedition, putting the ball in Jefferson Davis's court. The decision of war, in the eye of the public, was his to make or deny. The message that Lincoln sends for the Confederate leadership is delivered to the governor of South Carolina on April 8th. That information was immediately telegraphed to Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Richmond. Davis, with this information, is going to decide that it is time now to demand the surrender of the fort, and if the garrison doesn't surrender, take it by military force. Davis is going to send his general on the ground in Charleston, a man by the name of P.G.T. Beauregard, orders detailing how to proceed. His deadline for military action, if Major Anderson refuses to surrender, is April 12th. We're getting down to the moment of truth now, and people are starting to recognize this. Just listen to the warning that the Confederate Secretary of State, a guy named Robert Toombs, gives Jefferson Davis when he hears of the decision that's been made. Quote, "It will lose us every friend at the North. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest. Legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." End quote. It's crazy how accurate that is. Now, it's going to take a long time to end this rebellion and reunite the states into the bonds of the Union. But it's getting ready to start right now. On April 11th, General Beauregard, that's the commander of the Confederate forces there in Charleston, sends a message containing his formal demands for the surrender of Fort Sumter to Major Anderson. An interesting side note here, and this is something we will see often throughout this war. But Beauregard had been taught by Anderson while he was a student at West Point. He had great respect for the man. I have to imagine that this was not only a very uncomfortable situation that Beauregard found himself in, but most likely a very heartbreaking one. Just moments earlier, he had been on the same side as Major Anderson. It had been his mentor, in a way. But, like so many times throughout this war, old friendships will be overlooked as what the people of this era considered to be their duty required they fight those once respected and loved people opposite them. The U.S. garrison was significantly outnumbered and outgunned by this point. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her book Team of Rivals, has the ratio at 60 to 9,000. I don't know if that's 100% accurate. I have found numbers different from that. But regardless, just know that those poor guys that are manning Fort Sumter at this moment are insanely outnumbered. Anderson is going to refuse to surrender his post when he receives Beauregard's demand. The two commanders will exchange a total of 5 dispatches over the next few hours, both of them trying to find another way of handling this situation. But in the very early morning hours of April 12th, one final dispatch is delivered to Major Anderson. It says, quote, "By the authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States, we have the honor to notify you that he will open the fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time. We have the honor to be, very respectfully, your obedient servants, James Chestnut, Jr., aide-de-camp, and Stephen D. Lee, aide-de-camp." End quote. James Chestnut's wife, a woman by the name of Mary Chestnut, will actually keep some of the best records of the war on either side, North or South. She will write in her diary regularly and very detailed about so many intimate moments like what's getting ready to happen here. She has a first-hand account of the bombardment of Fort Sumter that's pretty fascinating. At least it's fascinating for us now. But at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, it wasn't so fascinating for the Union garrison. The bombardment would begin and continue for 34 hours before Major Anderson decides to surrender the fort. There are going to be no deaths on either side as a direct result of the actual shooting back and forth, the engagement. There will be one U.S. Army soldier that'll be killed, but that'll be from an exploding gun during a attempted 100-gun salute after the fort surrenders. There's going to be a lot of honors paid to the U.S. garrison there because we're still early in the war. Not too long after that, Major Anderson and his men are transported by ship back to New York as the Confederate troops in Charleston occupy Fort Sumter. The war between North and South had just begun.
Are you thinking about starting your own podcast or YouTube channel, but find yourself in need of things like a logo, animation for your videos, or digital marketing materials? If so, Colby and I recommend using Fiverr. Fiverr bills itself as the world's largest digital services marketplace with over 11 million users in 190 countries. With Fiverr, you can find anything you need when it comes to graphics and design, digital marketing, writing and translation, video and animation, music and audio, programming and tech, business, and trending data. A whole world of freelance talent at your fingertips. Fiverr gives you quality work done quickly and at prices that work for every budget. And for your peace of mind, when commissioning one of their freelancers, you get protected payment every time, meaning you won't pay for something until you approve the work, so you never have to worry that your money is going to waste. With Fiverr, you also enjoy 24/7 support. Visit americafogofwar.com and follow the link Shop Fiverr, located in the menu at the top of the homepage, and find the right solution for you today.
The day after the surrender of Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for 75,000 men to be provided by the states as militia to serve for 3 months' time to put an end to this rebellion. And the response by northern states is going to be overwhelming. So many young guys are going to volunteer for service that many states will offer to send more men than were asked for. There are other responses to this, though. One of the big ones being the states of the Upper South would finally answer the question that had been on everyone's mind for so long. They'd pick a side. 6 of the 8 states from the Upper South are going to refuse Lincoln's call outright. Their governors are going to send replies to Lincoln that give their various reasons as to why they can't or why they don't want to. But the one that sums up the general opinion of most of these governors is the one that's written by Tennessee's governor. This is what he had to say, quote, "Tennessee will furnish not a single man for the purpose of coercion, but 50,000 if necessary for the defense of our rights and those of our Southern brothers," end quote. In more simple terms, the ball had started and states were picking their dancing partners. For Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina, they chose the South. They're going to almost immediately secede and join the Confederacy. And this is a huge deal for the South. Like I had mentioned just a little bit ago, the Upper South could really dictate not only the outcome of the war, but the future of either one of these nation states, so if you look at the South as a nation state. For instance, Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina have the first, second, and third largest white populations out of the entire Confederacy. And like I had mentioned just a little bit earlier, the white population is important, especially when considering, the Confederate military in this era, is because that's where the bulk of their fighting guys are going to come from. Now, these states will also contribute things like manufacturing capabilities, crops for food supplies, and large numbers of horses and mules. All of these things could now be contributed to the Southern war effort. But support for the Confederacy wasn't complete throughout these states. There's going to be a senator from Tennessee as well as a few congressmen, and a few congressmen from the western portion of Virginia as well that are going to remain loyal to the Union. And instead of reporting to Richmond, they'll take their place in Washington, D.C. for the remainder of the war. Now, those elected officials, even though they're just a few men, they're representative of the people in those districts, the districts that voted them into office. And these are districts that are fairly large and that will cause a continuous problem for the Confederate cause throughout the entirety of the war. Another effect of the surrender of Fort Sumter is very quickly afterwards, in some cases even before the Upper South had actually seceded, state troops are going to begin making moves to seize federal property just as they had done in the Deep South for the months leading up to this. In April, 1,000 Virginian volunteers are going to show up at Harper's Ferry, and they're going to capture the armory along with its stores of weapons and rifle-making machinery. All of that now in the possession of the Confederate government to be used in the war effort. Now, the Union garrison stationed there did attempt to destroy what they could to keep out of the enemy's hands, but they're also trying to get out of there quickly. They don't want to get captured, so they failed to do it properly, and the Virginian militia are able to, salvage almost all of it. Something very similar happens in Norfolk at the Naval Yard around the same time. There's going to be another formation of Virginian militia, this one quite a bit larger than the one that captures Harper's Ferry, is going to capture the Naval Yard there. By the way, this is the largest shipbuilding and ship repair facility in the South. This is a very, very valuable asset. It's going to have multiple warships and near 1,000 cannons on site, both very, very important to the South. But again, the Union garrison failed to destroy most of the supplies and weaponry there, so the Virginia militia capture it. Now those guns would be sent to forts throughout the Confederacy, as well as various units, all trying to arm up and prepare themselves for the war that was right at their front door. The Virginians will also capture another very vital piece of weaponry, a steam frigate that would very soon gain international fame in this war, a ship called the USS Merrimack. The speed and ease with which rebel militia captured those supplies and installations shows the U.S. government and the people of the North how unprepared and vulnerable the Union was on its borders with the Confederacy. Officials in Washington during this period are concerned over the very realistic possibility that April might also see a coup d'etat attempted by secessionist forces. Even cities and states that are considered firmly committed to the Union possess large numbers of Confederate sympathizers. For example, a regiment of Massachusetts militia marching to Washington on their way to answer Lincoln's call for troops is attacked by a mob while passing through Baltimore. The Massachusetts troops will fight back, obviously, and the result is 4 soldiers and 12 civilians dead or dying in the streets of Baltimore. Now, that militia regiment will eventually make it to D.C. later in the day. Behind them, that mob of angry citizens in Baltimore start to destroy vital bridges and cut telegraph lines, all leading to Washington, D.C. The capital was, in effect, being cut off from the rest of the Union by angry civilians. And again, this is an area where I try to put myself in President Lincoln's shoes, because what do you do in this situation if you're the president? This is beyond crazy. How do you not only handle the things happening in your administration, like I had talked about a little earlier, or prepare a new volunteer army for war, but at the same time, how do you get the civilian populace under control in an area you thought was already on your side? The responsibility of having to decide what to do next in a situation like this has to be in the top 3 on the list of most stressful decisions made by a U.S. president ever in the entire history of the country, 1776 to now. I can't imagine the weight of that responsibility. But eventually those telegraph lines into D.C. would be repaired along with the other infrastructure the mob destroyed. But the problem still remained. The U.S. government couldn't function at all, let alone effectively, if they're surrounded by enemy actors. Well, Lincoln's first step in correcting all of this is to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in a portion of Maryland. Essentially, that's declaring martial law, or in layman's terms, military law. He'll also send federal troops to occupy Baltimore and other key points throughout Maryland, and this show of force is effective at restoring order in Baltimore and the rest of Maryland. And that's great if Maryland is the only place stuff like this is happening. Unfortunately for Lincoln, it's not. It's happening in places like Kentucky, too. And the state is extremely divided over which government should receive its support, the Union or the Confederacy. And at first, the governor will attempt to stay neutral. He'll refuse Lincoln's call for men, but he will also refuse Jefferson Davis when he makes a similar request. But that neutrality is short-lived. Soon the governor is going to begin assisting Southern agents in organizing Confederate militia. He's going to call them state guards, and he places them under the command of officers that are loyal to the South and the Confederacy. Unionists as well will also organize militia units, and they'll be called home guards. And the two opposing groups of Kentuckians very soon would confront each other on the battlefield. Missouri is another place all this is happening. And for Missouri, it could be said that the Civil War actually started in 1854 during Bleeding Kansas. Remember, that was the fight between border ruffians and Jayhawkers, where John Brown kind of got some of his first little bits of combat experience. Well, the fall of Fort Sumter is going to see that fight escalate in size and violence, and eventually it'll morph into a fight that seems far more personal and vindictive than what we see in the other theaters of the war. Union troops under a commander who would soon become very popular, known as the Young Napoleon to the populace, will engage and defeat Confederate forces throughout Western Virginia at places like Philippi and Rich Mountain. He'll gain control of the vital B&O Railroad and kill a Confederate general in the process. And it can't be overlooked how important a role things like railroads will play throughout this war. This war is going to see vast innovation and change in every area of life. And these things that historically wouldn't have been considered important or even a contributor in any way to the war effort are going to become those pivotal things that dictate the outcome of a campaign. Seemingly overnight after Fort Sumter, the country underwent drastic changes. The excitement over the prospect of war quickly transforms into chaos from its arrival. And in her book, Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin has a great passage that addresses the monumental change that's swept over the country. Quote, "A war had begun that no one imagined would last 4 years and cost greater than 600,000 lives, more than the cumulative total of all our other wars from the Revolution to Iraq. The devastation and sacrifice would reach into every community, into almost every family, in a nation of 31.5 million. In proportion to today's population, the number of deaths would exceed 5 million. End quote. Well, the war that would create such devastation for the country, at this point, was fully underway. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, make sure you never miss new ones by subscribing to the show on your podcast app of choice. And if you want to help us out with growing the show and enable us to bring you better content and more of it, then Brett and I ask that you leave us a 5-star review. It does a lot in helping us. Brett and I thank you for listening. And until next time, stay frosty.